family tree. Right out of the gate, Matthew's gospel, his good news, hits you with some seemingly really boring stuff. But I have this confession that I'm going to make. I've really started to love those super boring Bible passages. I find boring Bible passages to be really interesting. Those passages that make me wonder, how did this get into the Bible? Why is this included? And in the case of our study today, and the study that's carrying us all through Advent, we have this great example of what on the surface might be a boring Bible passage, a family tree. But it inspires all sorts of questions for me. The author of Matthew included it in the first place, and throughout history, historical scholars and biblical scholars kept it in there, so it must be there to teach us something. So what am I supposed to take away from this? What application can be drawn from such a boring Bible passage? And we already had a great introduction last week from Audrey as to how genealogy teaches us something and why the author of the focus book for Advent chose to focus on the women in Jesus' lineage. But I'd like you to humor me a bit as I rehash some of that. So I have this book that details my family history. And in its pages, I can read about my own Stutzman family. So I am Mitchell Dean Stutzman, married to Jasmine, and our children up there, the son of Kermit Dean Stutzman and Lila Pauline Glenn. Kermit is the son of Melvin Stutzman and Eva Marie Hirschberger. Melvin is the son of Levi L. Stutzman and Katie Bontrager. Levi L. was the son of Levi J. Stutzman and Lizzie Schrock. And Levi J. was the son of Joseph Stutzman and Rachel Yoder, and so on and so on and so on. And some of you may have a book like the one I've described that is in your possession. Some of you may be experts at playing the Mennonite game, making connections and finding how many ways you're connected or related to someone. And in my experience, that game is not unique to Mennonites. I found that every particular people group that I interact with has their own game to find out how people are connected. Others of you may not have a book with everything written down in that way, but a quick Google search yields all sorts of ways to explore our family systems. Ancestry.com, FamilySearch.com, even FindAgrave.com are all ways that you can trace back the folks that came before you. And some folks in our midst may not have much information very far back because of the realities of colonialism and slavery or any other number of reasons. But there exist services like 23andMe, MyHeritage DNA testing, and Living DNA that can provide information on what part of the world you can trace your people back to. So why is the study of genealogy or knowing any of that information about your DNA important? Why are there entire industries in the marketplace dedicated to helping people track down who their ancestors were? I propose that the reason we care is that knowing something about our people, knowing something about where we come from, gives us a sense of being, gives us a sense of place. It gives us a way to understand who we are and where we fit in the world. And that's why Matthew puts his family tree right at the beginning of the story. It supports the narrative. It isn't just extra information. Matthew uses this list of names to communicate something important about who Jesus is, where Jesus fits. Matthew gives Jesus a sense of place. And it's worth paying attention to the names that Matthew puts in Jesus' family line. It's common for biblical authors to use family lineage to communicate something very specific about the subject of their writing. This is because the social context of that world operated within this honor-shame framework. It was your goal to have honor and to avoid shame. And honor and shame could move in one of two ways. It could be ascribed or acquired. So acquired honor came through sacrifice or by receiving it gifted by another. But ascribed honor was passed through family lineage. So it's no coincidence then that Matthew puts this family tree right at the beginning of his gospel, of his good news, to start the action of the story. Matthew takes time at the outset to unpack Jesus' pedigree. His family lineage is full of royalty and priests, and then a few others. This list proves something to readers. The names of priests and kings communicates that family honor. Matthew and Luke are the only two gospel writers that spend any time going through Jesus' family tree. And there are some key differences between the two family trees to pay attention to. Each gospel writer has a particular aim, a particular message to communicate through their family tree. And there are a couple names that Audrey already went through that I want to make specific note of in the family, in addition to our main focus for today and what it teaches us. Right away, in chapter 1, verse 1 of Matthew, he points out that Jesus is a son of David, a son of Abraham. Matthew then begins his family tree with Abraham. So why Abraham? Abraham is the father of the Jewish nation. And Matthew famously focuses on how Jesus is the fulfillment of Hebrew scriptures and the answer to what the Jewish people have been waiting for. Abraham, that Jesus is going to bring God's blessing, that blessing that was promised to Abraham and his descendants. The blessing that was promised to Abraham is still coming and will be fulfilled by this Jesus that we will follow through the rest of the gospel. And then David. By placing Jesus within the line of David, Matthew confirms for his audience that Jesus is indeed the Messianic king. The Messiah was to come through the line of David. David, who had been king, royalty. This Jesus has royal pedigree. Within the ancient worldview, you are an extension of your family. It's not just that you are a product of your family, but you are your family. So what could be a really boring family tree shows us that this Jesus that we're going to follow through the rest of the gospel, this Jesus that we will hear preach and teach, that we will see call disciples, that we will watch perform miracles, that we will see crucified, that we will witness raised on the third day and then ascend into heaven, is indeed the Messianic King who's come to bring God's blessing to all the people of the world. This is one of the ways that the writer is telling us to pay attention to who this Jesus is. And wow, that is exciting stuff in a really boring section of Scripture. Through this family tree and through compelling storytelling, Matthew tells readers to hold on tight because this Jesus is really something. So, as we continue to journey through Advent, remember what this genealogy communicates to us, that this Jesus is the Messianic King that was promised, that will bring God's blessing to the children of Abraham and to all people. And that is exciting news. So today we explore the second woman named in Jesus' lineage, Rahab. We read first about Rahab in the book of Joshua, and then she also appears in the family lineage of Jesus, and then in 2 New Testament epistles. And in looking at the original story of Rahab, I think it's important to understand a little bit about the book of Joshua. Whenever I read my Bible, the question of authorship is one of the first questions that I ask myself. I once heard it said specifically about the epistles, but I think you can expand the analogy to the whole of Scripture, that when we read our Bibles, we're reading someone else's mail. That each and every word was written by someone at a particular time, in a particular place, with a particular audience in mind. And so when we think about authorship, the who, the what, the where, the when, and the to whom, we may receive even more value from our scriptures. And that being said, there's not agreement on who wrote this book and when. Some believe that Joshua himself was the one that wrote this book. Other scholars would say that this text was written hundreds of years later, during the time in which the people of Israel were in Babylon in exile. And I personally would subscribe to that school of thought. That this narrative of the book of Joshua was not written by Joshua himself, but instead written by a group seeking to remind the people who they are and of their relationship to God. So the book of Joshua picks up right after the death of Moses. The people have been wandering in the desert. Moses gets to peek into the promised land, and then he dies, thus promoting Joshua into the position of leadership. And then this book goes about painting a picture of Joshua as the new Moses. And there are some striking similarities in their stories and some contrasts and allusions that solidify that for us. The people, as they enter the promised land that was promised to them, cross the Jordan River on dry ground, echoing the crossing of the Red Sea, led by Moses. Joshua sends some spies into the land to scope things out, just like Moses had sent spies ahead to look at things. Only things go a little bit better this time around when the spies return with the news of what they see. And after jumping a little further into our story and into Rahab's story, we hear echoes of the Exodus and the red blood of the Passover lamb on the door frames as Rahab ties a scarlet red cord on her window to save her family. The narrative of Joshua is reminding the people of who they are, where they come from, and what God has done for them. But within this story that focuses on what it means to be an insider, what it means to be God's chosen people, we have this story of an outsider, the story of a Canaanite, a woman, a prostitute. So backing up, Joshua gets his promotion into leadership after the death of Moses. He tells the people to obey God. They cross the Jordan. He sends spies into Jericho specifically to scope out what's going on there, how they might win a battle against them, what sort of loot they're going to get, etc. Enter Rahab. The spies, upon arriving in Jericho, enter the home of a woman named Rahab. And the fact that we know her name is interesting. Hereder, in her book, in the Advent Focus text, points this out by saying that this is not the way that Scripture usually works. We don't know the name of the spies, these men. We don't even know the name of the king, but we know the name of this prostitute in the city. And here's the Cliff Notes version of the story. The Israelite spies enter the city and stay at the home of Rahab. And now the king finds out that they're in the city somewhere and apparently has some idea that they're with Rahab and asks for her to turn over the spies to him. Rahab has hidden the men and then tells this little fib that, oh yeah, there were some men here, but I didn't know who they were and they're gone already. You should go chase them. And all the while she's hidden them up on the roof. So after the situation is safe, Rahab tells these spies, look, I know who you are, and I've heard about your God. And the people here have all heard about how your God has been destroying people in your path, and we're all pretty shaken up about it. But since I have protected you, can you help protect me and my family when your people come and wipe out Jericho? And they make a deal and tell her to tie this scarlet cord outside her window and say that anyone in her family that are in the house when they come back will be spared. And so the spies escape Jericho, head back to camp, and were able to share the information they needed to so they can win the battles that lie ahead. And now I debated whether or not to include anything in this time together about this particular thing. I'm going to deviate from my notes for a minute, which is dangerous. But this is a point, and when I particularly read stories in the Old Testament of violence and genocide and things all carried out by God, it's problematic for me. And I've spent some time thinking about that and trying to read and educate myself on what's going on, and some things that have helped me understand more of the literary context of this and the way that ancient peoples used language and how they wrote down their stories, and that have helped me understand more fully and reconcile some of my hard feelings about that. And I'd love to explore that more deeply at another time. But one of the things that really has leapt out for me is this idea in ancient texts using hyperbole to communicate. In the same way that they say they entered this city and everyone was destroyed, is no different from saying our favorite sports team slaughtered the competition. That this idea of using language to say it was a huge success, it doesn't necessarily mean everyone's dead. And one of the things that helps confirm that is modern science and archaeology saying we don't really have much evidence that there was this huge destruction that it says here. So how do we reconcile these things? And one of those ways is understanding how ancient authors used language and hyperbole to communicate what was going on. So there, tangent, we're back. So who is Rahab, and how was she able to pull this off? Herder in her book points out that Rahab is a woman living on the physical and metaphorical margins of her community. Her home is literally built into the city wall, and her line of work is not something that respectable women engage in. Her physical location and her status in society make her one of the few people in this town that the spies could interact with. Respectable women would not have their own house. They would be living in their father's house or with their husbands and not permitted to speak to men outside of their family system. But because of her occupation, she is afforded the opportunity to be the one who interacts with these spies, these outsiders in her community. Her status, her position, everything about her makes her the perfect candidate to help aid the heroes of our story. These pieces of her identity, which in her culture and community would have typically been liabilities, become assets. It is this action from the margins that propels the story of God's people. Throughout the story of God, we see actions from the margins propelling the story. We hear over and over again how God uses unlikely characters to accomplish God's mission. Our expectations are constantly being disrupted. While Jesus' family tree contains the names of priests and royalty, it also is filled with disrupted expectations, like Rahab the prostitute, and other people that we might not have expected to see or who didn't always do what we thought they were going to do. And it all serves the story of God. The author of Hebrews includes Rahab in a long list of heroes of the faith, and we got pieces of that passage today, but I would encourage you to go and read all of Hebrews 11 sometime. It's a fascinating study. Rahab's in this long list of heroes of the faith, and as I read through the list of names, I see example after example of disrupted expectations. God uses Joseph, this farm boy sold into slavery by his older brothers, who later becomes second in command to Pharaoh to rescue and care for the people. That was unexpected. And then God uses Moses, this baby rescued from the river and adopted into Pharaoh's house, given status and privilege, who later gives all of that up to embrace the status of slave and outsider, to lead the Hebrew people out of slavery. That was unexpected. God seems to delight in disrupting and upsetting human expectations. Abraham and Sarah didn't conceive their promised heir until they were so old that conceiving a child was laughable. And when Joshua sent out the spies to Jericho, it was a single Canaanite woman, Rahab the prostitute, that protected the spies. God is not bound by our expectations. Mary, the mother of Jesus, was somehow okay with yielding herself to a God whose plans for the coming Messiah would upset everyone's expectations. It would make no sense. It would be full of scandal. An unwed woman, someone with no status, ushering in the promised Messiah. Even Jesus, an outsider in the religious political system of his day, is the answer to everything. God is constantly disrupting expectations. Herder, in her book, names that being on the edge means that we have little to lose and therefore will likely be willing to take more risks and confront those in power. So as we consider Rahab, this brilliant and clever and skilled, complicated master negotiator and faithful follower of God, may we watch for action on the margins. And may we be open to having our expectations disrupted. May those of us on the outside of structures of power and privilege be bold in living into our calling. May those of us nearer to the center and those in positions of power and privilege watch for and elevate those voices on the margins. By watching for the action on the margins, we might just find where God is most at work. In this season of Advent, of expectant waiting, let's expect to have our expectations disrupted in ways that we never saw coming.